My dear friends, let me invite you into a story that begins with something as simple as morning coffee, but unfolds into one of the most powerful lessons about protecting what matters most. Picture this. It's 42 degrees in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the desert wind is whispering secrets against the screen door of a small adobe house. Inside, a 69-year-old woman named Evelyn Hart is measuring exactly 12 ounces of coffee into her French press, the same ritual she's followed for 43 years of marriage, and now 3 years of widowhood. You might think this is just another elderly widow story, but hold on to your coffee cups, because what happened to Evelyn could happen to any of us. In a world where family betrayal inheritance schemes are becoming more common, where power of attorney abuse lurks behind well-meaning smiles, this is the story of a woman who discovered that protecting inheritance isn't just about money. It's about protecting your very soul. Evelyn's fingers automatically reached for the turquoise bracelet on her wrist, the one her mother had given her decades ago. It wasn't expensive, probably worth $30 at most, but it connected her to something deeper than money, deeper than the $41 million she quietly inherited when Walter's wind and solar rights sold, along with a stake in the local utility company. Yes, you heard that right, $41 million. But this isn't just another inspiring widow story about sudden wealth. It's about what happens when family discovers that wealth, and how one woman's silence became her greatest weapon. Walter Brooks, that was her late husband's name, had been the kind of man who fixed a neighbor's fence without being asked and always kept his promises. Before his passing, he'd left Evelyn something more valuable than money, a red leather portfolio with detailed instructions. Signed slow or not at all, he'd written in his careful handwriting, "Trust the lawyers we chose together, not the ones who show up uninvited." At the time, Evelyn thought it was just Walter being cautious. She had no idea it would become her armor. The morning this story really begins, Evelyn was standing at her kitchen window, watching a hummingbird hover at the feeder outside. Such tiny creatures, yet so fierce, so determined. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to discover she had more in common with that little bird than she'd ever imagined. The phone rang, breaking her peaceful reverie. It was her only son, Evan, calling with news that should have been joyful. "Mom, Sloan and I are engaged." His voice carried that particular mixture of excitement and nervousness that only comes with big life changes. Sloan Archer, beautiful, charming, with a smile that could light up a room and ambitions that stretched far beyond the desert horizon. Evelyn had met her a few times. Notice how she always steered conversations toward money, how her eyes would calculate rather than simply observe. But this was her son's happiness, and Evelyn had learned that sometimes loving someone means biting your tongue. The engagement period flew by in a whirlwind of wedding plans and bridal showers. Evelyn watched from the sidelines as Sloan transformed from her son's girlfriend into the family's new center of gravity. There were subtle shifts. The way family dinners suddenly happened at restaurants Evelyn couldn't afford on her library treasurer's pension. The way conversations stopped when she entered rooms. The way her opinions somehow carried less weight than they used to. But Evelyn had been married to Walter Brooks for 4 decades. She understood that patience is sometimes the most powerful tool in a woman's arsenal. She kept her observations to herself, maintained her morning coffee ritual, and trusted in the wisdom Walter had tried to share with her through that red leather portfolio. She had no idea that her son's wedding day would become the first battle in a war she never saw coming. The wedding reception was held at the La Posada Resort, all adobe elegance and twinkling lights strung between ancient cottonwood trees. Evelyn arrived wearing her best dress, navy blue with small pearl buttons, and that turquoise bracelet that never left her wrist. She'd been looking forward to watching her son take his first dance as a married man, to feeling that particular joy that comes with watching your child begin their own chapter. Instead, she found herself seated at a table near the kitchen doors, where the clatter of dishes competed with the string quartet. From where she sat, she could barely see the dance floor. Around her were other overflow guests, elderly relatives and longtime family friends who'd been relegated to what amounted to the children's table for seniors. Meanwhile, Sloane's mother and her socialite friends held court at the head table, their laughter carrying across the reception like crystal chimes. It was May Alvarez, her neighbor and fellow widow, who leaned over during the salad course and whispered what Evelyn was trying so hard not to think. Honey, they parked us by the kitchen like we're disposable. May was 72, with the kind of directness that comes from burying a husband, raising 3 children alone, and surviving long enough to stop caring about other people's comfort with the truth. Evelyn watched Sloane glide across the dance floor in her designer gown, all flowing silk and strategic sparkles. She was beautiful, no doubt about it. And when Evan looked at her, his whole face transformed with a kind of devotion that reminded Evelyn of how Walter used to look at her. That's what made the seating arrangement sting so much, not the physical discomfort, but the message it sent. This was how the new family order would work. Sloane's people mattered, and everyone else was background noise. The band played, glasses clinked. Speeches were made about love and forever and building a life together. Through it all, Evelyn maintained a gracious smile she perfected over decades of being a library treasurer's wife. Pleasant, appropriate, unremarkable. But underneath that smile, something was shifting. She found herself thinking about Walter's words, about signing slow or not at all, about the difference between kindness and surrender. When the evening finally wound down and the last dance had been danced, Evelyn drove home to the quiet Santa Fe streets, past the art galleries and chili roasting vendors, past the cathedral where she and Walter had been married all those years ago. The desert air was clean and cold, and through her open window, she could smell sage and the faint wood smoke from someone's fireplace. Back in her adobe house, she made herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat in Walter's old chair, the red leather portfolio open on her lap. His handwriting looked back at her from pages of careful instructions, contingency plans, and warnings she was only beginning to understand. Sometimes, he'd written on the final page, "Love means holding the line." She closed the portfolio and placed it carefully back in the bedroom safe, not knowing that in just 3 days, those words would become her battle cry. That night, Evelyn Hart fell asleep to the sound of the screen door clicking gently in the desert wind, a tiny sound that would soon become the soundtrack to the most important stand of her life. 3 days after the wedding, Evelyn was in her garden when she heard car doors slamming in her driveway. Through the morning light filtering through her apple tree, she saw Sloane's red BMW and an unfamiliar black sedan. Her stomach tightened with the kind of intuition that comes from 7 decades of reading people and situations. This wasn't a social call. Sloane emerged from her car carrying a leather briefcase, her wedding glow replaced by something more businesslike. Beside her walked a man in an expensive suit, his hair perfectly styled and his smile a little too practiced. This had to be Gregory Hale, the attorney Sloane had mentioned, the one who supposedly specialized in family protection planning. Even from a distance, Evelyn could see the way he assessed her property, his eyes moving across the modest adobe house like an appraiser calculating value. "Evelyn," Sloane's voice carried across the yard with forced cheerfulness. "We have some wonderful news to share with you. This is Gregory Hale, and he's going to help us make sure you're protected as you get older." Protected. The word hung in the desert air like a question mark. Evelyn set down her gardening gloves and walked toward them, noting how Gregory's handshake lasted just a beat too long, how his smile never quite reached his eyes. He had the kind of voice that was used to being listened to, the kind of presence that filled rooms and made decisions for other people. "Mrs. Hart," Gregory began, his tone smooth as fine whiskey, "Sloane has been sharing her concerns about your future security. With your late husband's estate settled and considerable assets to manage, we want to ensure you have proper support structures in place." They moved into Evelyn's living room, where Sloane immediately took charge, clearing space on the coffee table for Gregory's documents. Evelyn noticed how comfortable her new daughter-in-law seemed in her space, how quickly she'd assumed the role of family decision-maker. The elderly widow story was playing out exactly as it had for thousands of women before her. Adult children, usually with the best of intentions, deciding that age automatically meant incapacity. Gregory opened his briefcase with a flourish of a man accustomed to impressive moments. Inside were thick stacks of legal documents, all precisely organized with colored tabs and sticky notes marking signature lines. "We prepared a comprehensive protection package," he announced, spreading papers across Evelyn's hand-quilted coffee table cover. "A durable power of attorney, healthcare proxy, and updated financial management authorization. It's just standard procedure," Sloane added quickly, perching on the edge of Walter's old armchair. Everyone our age has these documents. It doesn't change anything. It just means if something happens, Evan and I can step in to help without legal complications. Evelyn picked up the durable power of attorney, scanning the dense legal language that essentially signed over control of her financial life. The document was dated today, clearly prepared in advance of this visit. Gregory had brought a notary stamp and was already arranging his official papers. Everything about this moment screamed preparation, coordination, urgency. "I appreciate your concern," Evelyn said quietly, her voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in her head. "But I have an attorney who handles my affairs. Ruth Delgado. Walter and I worked with her for years." Gregory's professional smile flickered slightly. "Of course, and I'm sure Ms. Delgado is competent for routine matters. But this requires specialized expertise in elder law and asset protection. The longer we wait, the more vulnerable your estate becomes to potential challenges, tax implications, even creditor claims." It was masterfully done. The implication that her current attorney wasn't adequate, the suggestion of mysterious threats lurking around every corner, the gentle pressure wrapped in concern. This was clearly not Gregory's first time convincing an elderly person to sign over their autonomy. Sloane leaned forward, her voice dropping to the tone usually reserved for speaking to children or people with diminished capacity. "Evelyn, we just want to make sure you're taken care of. These documents protect you and protect the family. The family, not our family or the Hart family, but the family." As if Evelyn's 43 years of building that family meant less than Sloane's 3 days of legally joining it. Evelyn felt something crystallize inside her chest, a clarity that cut through the careful manipulation like a blade through silk. "I understand your concerns," she repeated, closing the power of attorney document and placing it back on the stack. "But I won't be signing anything today. I'll need Ruth to review these documents first." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Gregory's professional mask slipped just enough to reveal something harder underneath. "Mrs. Hart, with respect, delay can be dangerous. These protections need to be in place before any cognitive decline begins. Waiting until you need them often means it's too late to implement them legally." It was expertly phrased, the suggestion that she might already be showing signs of decline, the implication that resistance to signing proved the need for protection. Evelyn had watched this exact scenario play out with other women her age, seen how family members and their attorneys could make refusal to surrender control seem like evidence of incompetence. "Nevertheless," Evelyn said, standing up, "I'll wait for Ruth's advice." Sloane's perfectly composed expression cracked slightly. "But, Evelyn, we just want to help. Families shouldn't need lawyers between them." There was the emotional manipulation dressed up as family loyalty. Evelyn looked at her daughter-in-law's face, still beautiful, but now showing traces of something sharper, more calculating. She thought about Walter's warnings, about signing slow or not at all, about the difference between love and control. "Family especially needs lawyers between them," Evelyn replied. "That's what Walter taught me." Gregory began repacking his documents with the efficiency of someone whose time was valuable and had just been wasted. "We'll leave these with you to review," he said, though his tone suggested this was a temporary setback rather than a final answer. "But Mrs. Hart, I strongly encourage you not to delay. Asset protection planning becomes more complicated with each passing day." After they left, Evelyn stood in her living room looking at the stack of legal documents on her coffee table. They sat there like a small paper bomb, innocent-looking but dangerous. She could hear Walter's voice in her memory. "When someone wants your signature today, that's usually the day you should wait until tomorrow." She made herself another cup of coffee and sat in Walter's chair, the one that still smelled faintly of his aftershave and the peppermint gum he'd chewed to help him quit smoking. Outside, the hummingbird was back at its feeder, its wings beating so fast they were just a blur. Such a tiny creature, but no one could force it to land where it didn't want to go. Evelyn picked up her phone and dialed Ruth Delgado's number. It was time to discover exactly what protections Walter had really left her, and whether his love had been strong enough to shield her from the very family they created together. As she listened to the phone ring, She twisted the turquoise bracelet around her wrist and made herself a promise. Whatever happened next, she would not be disposable. The next morning brought that particular clarity that comes with desert sunshine and a good night's sleep. Evelyn was deadheading her roses when May Alvarez appeared at the fence between their properties, coffee mug in hand, and that look in her eyes that meant she had something important to say. May had been widowed for 8 years now, had buried her husband Miguel after 45 years of marriage, and somehow managed to emerge from that grief stronger rather than bitter. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed when your newspaper sat uncollected for too long, who always had an extra casserole in her freezer, and who had never once in 8 years of friendship asked Evelyn a question she didn't really want answered. "Coffee's getting cold," May said, settling herself onto Evelyn's patio chair without invitation. That was May's way. She didn't wait for permission to care about people. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the morning light paint the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in shades of pink and gold. Finally, May set down her mug and looked directly at Evelyn. "So, the wedding." Evelyn felt her shoulders tense. She'd been dreading this conversation, partly because she valued May's opinion, and partly because she wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. "They parked you by the kitchen," May continued, her voice matter-of-fact rather than sympathetic. "Like you were hired help instead of the mother of the groom." There was the truth that Evelyn had been trying to package into something more palatable. She told herself the seating was just poor planning, that Sloane had been overwhelmed with wedding details, that it didn't really matter where she sat as long as Evan was happy. But May's blunt assessment cut through all those careful rationalizations. "It was just seating arrangements," Evelyn said weakly. May snorted, a sound that managed to convey 40 years of raising children and dealing with people who thought she was too old to notice when they were trying to manipulate her. "Honey, I've been to enough weddings to know the difference between poor planning and a power play. They were sending you a message." The hummingbird appeared at its feeder, hovering for a moment before darting away. Evelyn watched its flight pattern, so precise, so determined. "Maybe I'm reading too much into things." "And maybe," May said, leaning forward, "you're reading exactly enough. Tell me about the visitors yesterday." Evelyn shouldn't have been surprised that May had noticed Gregory's black sedan and the formal way he'd carried himself up her walkway. In a neighborhood where most excitement involved arguing about watering schedules and which chili vendor was best, a strange lawyer was bound to attract attention. So Evelyn told her about the documents, about Gregory's smooth pressure tactics, about Sloane's assumption that, of course, Evelyn would sign whatever they put in front of her. May listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow, but mostly just providing the kind of steady attention that encouraged honesty. "Did you sign?" May asked when Evelyn finished. "No. Walter always said to sign slow, or not at all." "Smart man, you're Walter." May was quiet for a moment, then looked directly at Evelyn with the kind of intensity that made avoiding eye contact impossible. "You know what they were really asking for, don't you?" Evelyn did know, in that deep place where women store truths they're not quite ready to speak out loud. The durable power of attorney wasn't protection. It was permission. Permission to access accounts, make financial decisions, override her choices in the name of her own good. It was the legal equivalent of patting her on the head and taking away her car keys. "They want control," Evelyn said, the words feeling strange and terrible in her mouth. "They want control," May agreed. "And sweetheart, once you give that away, you never get it back. I've seen it happen to too many women like us. Adult children who decide their mother's independence is inconvenient, who wrap control in pretty words like safety and protection." May reached across the small patio table and took Evelyn's hand, her grip firm and warm. "You are not disposable, Evelyn Hart. You are not a problem to be managed or an asset to be protected. You are a grown woman who survived the Depression through your parents' stories, raised a son, built a marriage that lasted 43 years, and managed a library's finances for 30 years without losing a single penny." The words hit Evelyn like cool water on sun-parched earth. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed to hear them until May spoke them into the morning air. Somewhere along the way, between the wedding seating and the legal documents and Sloane's carefully concerned expressions, she'd begun to doubt her own capacity, her own worth, her own right to make decisions about her own life. But what if they're right? Evelyn heard herself asking, what if I'm getting too old to handle things properly? What if something happens and Evan can't help because I was too stubborn to sign the papers? May's laugh was warm and completely without mockery. Then you handle it the same way you've been handling life for 69 years, one day at a time, with help from people you choose to trust, not people who choose to help themselves to your trust. They sat together as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning coolness and settling into the kind of heat that made desert living both challenging and beautiful. May talked about her own experiences with well-meaning relatives who tried to convince her to move to assisted living, about the lawyer who'd suggested she simplify her finances by letting her oldest daughter manage everything. The thing about vultures, May said, is they circle before they land. And honey, I saw plenty of circling at that reception. As May gathered her coffee mug to head home, she paused at the patio door. Whatever Walter left you in that red folder is, I'm betting it wasn't just money. Men like Walter don't just provide, they prepare. You might want to take a closer look at what he really wanted you to understand. Evelyn spent the rest of the morning in Walter's old office, spreading the contents of the red leather portfolio across his desk. Legal documents, bank information, contact cards for attorneys and financial advisors she'd never met. But it was a handwritten letter, placed carefully on top of everything else, that made her breath catch in her throat. My dearest Evelyn, it began, if you're reading this again, it means someone is pressuring you to sign something. Don't. That evening, Evan called to check on how she was settling in after the wedding excitement. His voice carried a nervous energy that reminded Evelyn of when he was 12 years old and had broken Mrs. Patterson's window with a baseball. Guilty, worried, hoping the problem would somehow solve itself without requiring difficult conversations. Mom, how are you feeling about everything? The wedding, meeting Gregory, the new arrangements? New arrangements. Such a careful way to describe the systematic dismantling of her autonomy. Evelyn settled into Walter's chair, the red portfolio open beside her like a trusted advisor. I'm feeling thoughtful, she said. It's been quite a few days. Sloane's been worried that maybe we overwhelmed you with too much information at once. She knows how these legal documents can seem intimidating, and she wants to make sure you understand that we're not trying to take anything away from you. We're trying to add protections. The words were clearly Sloane's, delivered in Evan's voice. Evelyn could practically hear the coaching session that had preceded this call, how to reassure Mom, how to address her concerns, how to move her toward compliance without triggering more resistance. It was a mother and son conflict wrapped in good intentions and tied with ribbons of manipulation. Evelyn said quietly, can you come over? Just you. I'd like to talk. The pause that followed stretched long enough for Evelyn to hear the calculation happening on the other end of the line. Is everything okay? You're not having second thoughts about the documents, are you? Because Gregory really knows what he's talking about, and Sloane has done a lot of research on this stuff. Just come over, son. Please. An hour later, Evan stood on her doorstep, looking like a man caught between two forces he couldn't control. At 34, he still had the gentle demeanor that had made him her joy to raise. Conflict avoidant, thoughtful, loyal to a fault. But now that loyalty was being pulled in opposite directions, and the strain was written across his face in worry lines that hadn't been there 6 months ago. They sat at her kitchen table, the same one where she'd helped him with homework, where they'd talked through his career decisions and relationship questions over the years. Evelyn poured him the unsweetened iced tea he'd preferred since college and watched him fidget with the glass. Tell me about your marriage, she said finally. Evan's head snapped up, surprise replacing nervousness. What do you mean? Are you happy? Really happy, not just wedding day happy, but deep down satisfied with the choice you've made. It wasn't the question he'd expected, and his answer came slowly, like water finding its way through rock. Sloane is ambitious. She wants things for us, for our future. Sometimes that means making decisions that feel big, but she says that's how you build the life you want instead of just accepting the life you get. Evelyn heard what he wasn't saying, that Sloane's ambitions required resources, That building the life you want often meant taking control of someone else's life. That his new wife's grand plan somehow required his mother's signature on legal documents. "Son," Evelyn said, reaching across the table to still his restless hands, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me honestly. Are you afraid that I'm getting too old to handle my own affairs? Or are you afraid of what Sloan will do if I don't sign those papers?" The question hung between them. Like a bridge, Evan would have to choose whether to cross. Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling the screen door with that familiar clicking sound. Evan stared at his tea glass, and Evelyn watched 43 years of mothering flash through her mind. The scraped knees she'd bandaged, the nightmares she'd chase away, the confidence she tried to build in this gentle boy who'd grown into a man who still couldn't bear disappointing anyone. The silence stretched long enough for the truth to surface. When Evan finally looked up, his eyes held a kind of honesty that cost something to give. "She's already talking about what we could do with some of the inheritance," he admitted. "The business ideas she has, the house she wants to buy, the way we could set up our future. And when I mentioned that maybe we should slow down, that it was your money to decide about, He stopped, clearly struggling with how much truth he was willing to share. "She what?" She said that thinking like that was exactly why families end up in elder abuse situations. That leaving elderly parents to make their own financial decisions is actually a form of neglect. Evan's voice was barely above a whisper. "She has statistics, Mom. Stories about widows who lose everything to scam artists or bad investments. She makes it sound like protecting you from yourself is the most loving thing we could do." And there it was, the sophisticated manipulation that turned love into control and called it protection. Evelyn felt a surge of something that was part anger, part admiration for how thoroughly Sloan had researched the emotional pressure points that would move her husband toward compliance. "What do you think?" Evelyn asked. "Do you think I'm incompetent to manage my own affairs?" "No." The answer came quickly, emphatically. "You've been handling everything perfectly since Dad died. The house, the finances, your health decisions. You're doing fine. Then why the rush to sign documents that assume I'm not?" Evan's shoulders sagged as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks. "Because Sloan says waiting for a crisis to happen is irresponsible. Because she says loving someone means planning for worst-case scenarios. Because—" He stopped, looking miserable. "Because you're afraid she'll leave if you don't support her in this." It wasn't a question, and Evan's silence was answer enough. Evelyn felt her heart break a little for the son who'd inherited his father's gentle nature, but not his backbone, who wanted to keep peace so badly he was willing to sacrifice his mother's autonomy to avoid a fight with his wife. "Evan," she said softly, "what kind of marriage requires you betray your mother to prove your love?" The question hit its target. Evan's carefully constructed justifications crumbled, leaving only a 34-year-old man who was discovering that marriage to the wrong person could turn you into someone you didn't recognize. He put his head in his hands, and for a moment, he looked exactly like the little boy who'd come to her when the world felt too big and complicated to handle alone. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. Outside, the screen door clicked again in the wind, that small sound that was becoming the rhythm of Evelyn's resistance. She looked at her son, this man she'd raised to be kind, who'd somehow confused kindness with surrender, and felt the full weight of the choice before her. She could sign the papers, maintain family peace, and slowly disappear into the background of her own life. Or she could stand firm and risk losing her son to a woman who'd already proven she was willing to position family members against each other to get what she wanted. The inheritance drama was just beginning, but already Evelyn could see the real battle lines being drawn. Ruth Delgado's law office occupied the ground floor of a converted Victorian house near the Santa Fe Plaza, the kind of place where serious conversations happen behind thick wooden doors, and client confidentiality wasn't just a legal requirement, but a sacred trust. When Evelyn arrived with Gregory's documents, Ruth's experienced eyes took in the situation immediately. "Walter warned me this day might come," Ruth said, settling her reading glasses on her nose as she examined the power of attorney paperwork. "These documents are aggressive, broad powers, immediate implementation, very few safeguards." Ruth had been practicing elder law for 25 years, long enough to recognize when legal documents were crafted for the attorney's convenience rather than the client's protection. She'd seen too many cases where family boundaries had been crossed in the name of love, where emotional true story narratives about protection had masked financial exploitation. What Walter set up for you is different, Ruth continued, pulling out a thick file that bore Walter's careful handwriting on the tab. He was worried about exactly the scenario: family pressure, rushed decisions, people who might confuse your assets with their opportunities. Over the next 2 hours, Ruth walked Evelyn through Walter's actual protection plan, a carefully constructed fortress of legal safeguards that revealed just how well her husband had understood both love and danger. The revocable living trust contained spendthrift clauses that protected assets from creditor claims, including claims from family members who might have debts they were hoping to resolve with Evelyn's inheritance. The springing power of attorney Walter had created required not one, but 2 independent physicians plus a court-appointed evaluator to certify incapacity before it could take effect. Unlike Gregory's immediate implementation document, Walter's version recognized that true incapacity was medical, not familial, and required professional determination rather than family convenience. He also set up voice passwords at the bank, Ruth explained, and specified that any major financial changes require in-person verification, credit monitoring, no contest clauses in the will, HIPAA releases that specifically authorize Dr. Fields and May Alvarez to receive your medical information in emergencies. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes as she realized the depth of Walter's love and foresight. He'd anticipated not just her needs, but the pressure she might face, the people who might try to convince her that surrender was really protection. He'd built her a legal fortress and disguised it as routine paperwork. "There's one more thing," Ruth said, reaching into her desk drawer. She pulled out a box of business cards, simple white cards with elegant black lettering that read, "No legal documents signed without independent counsel. Please contact Ruth Delgado, attorney at law," followed by Ruth's phone number. Walter's idea, Ruth smiled. He said if anyone ever pressured you to sign something, you could just hand them one of these cards. Takes the argument out of your hands and puts it where it belongs, between lawyers. That afternoon, Evelyn drove to the bank and implemented the remaining security measures Walter had planned. Credit freeze across all 3 bureaus. Voice password activation. A notation in her file that any power of attorney changes required in-person verification, plus a waiting period. As she watched the bank manager stamp each form with official seals, Evelyn felt something shifting inside her chest. Not just security, but growing understanding of her own worth. The real test came 3 days later when Sloan arrived unannounced, this time without Gregory, but with a different kind of urgency. She found Evelyn in the kitchen, preparing chili rellenos with the patience that comes from making the same recipe for 30 years. "Evelyn, we need to talk." Sloan's usual charm was replaced by something sharper, more direct. "Gregory says you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. Families shouldn't need lawyers between them." There was that phrase again. Families shouldn't need lawyers, as if legal protection somehow negated emotional connection. Evelyn continued stuffing poblano peppers with cheese, her movement steady and unhurried. "On the contrary," Evelyn replied, "family especially needs lawyers. That's how you keep love from becoming leverage." Sloan's perfectly composed expression flickered. "I don't understand why you're being so suspicious. We're trying to help you." Evelyn set down her knife and really looked at her daughter-in-law. The designer purse, the manicured nails, the subtle desperation behind the beautiful facade. "Sloan, how much debt are you carrying?" The question landed like a physical blow. Sloan's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, defiance, before settling on injured innocence. "I don't think that's relevant to credit cards, wedding expenses, that business plan you mentioned to Evan." Evelyn's voice remained gentle, but there was steel underneath now. "Because if you're drowning financially, I understand the temptation to see my inheritance as a life preserver. But understanding doesn't mean enabling." For a moment, the kitchen filled with tension so thick it seemed to muffle the familiar sounds of the house settling, the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking on the wall. Then Sloan's mask slipped completely. "You have more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes," she said, her voice tight with frustration. Evan is your only child. That money is going to be his eventually anyway. Why not let it help your family now when we actually need it? Because, Evelyn said, reaching into her purse and placing one of Ruth's cards on the kitchen table. It's not your money. It's not even Evan's money. It's mine, earned through Walter's lifetime of work and careful planning, and I'll decide what happens to it and when. Sloan stared at the card as if it were a snake that might strike. You're choosing lawyers over family. I'm choosing protection over manipulation. Evelyn's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the finality in it. And Sloan, if you truly love my son, you'll understand the difference. That evening, as Evelyn watched the sun set over the desert from her patio, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the exhausted peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the energizing peace that comes from standing in your truth. The hummingbird was back at its feeder, and as she watched its fierce determination to feed itself rather than rely on handouts, she finally understood what Walter had been trying to tell her. Love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was just another form of surrender dressed up in pretty words. And Evelyn Hart was done surrendering. 2 weeks passed in an uneasy truce. Evan called dutifully every few days, his conversations careful and surface level, avoiding any mention of legal documents or family planning. Sloan had stopped dropping by unannounced, though Evelyn occasionally spotted her red BMW driving slowly past the house, as the surveillance had replaced direct confrontation. It was May who suggested they take a trip to the farmer's market downtown, claiming she needed help selecting the best green chiles for winter roasting. But Evelyn suspected her friend had other motives. May had that purposeful look she got when she was orchestrating something for someone's own good. The Santa Fe farmer's market buzzed with its usual Saturday energy, vendors calling out prices in both English and Spanish, tourists photographing everything from hand-woven textiles to organic honey, locals moving to the crowd with the efficiency of people who knew exactly which stalls offered the best deals. Evelyn was examining a display of autumn squash when she heard familiar voices from the next aisle over. Sloane's laugh carried that particular note of forced brightness that meant she was performing rather than genuinely amused. Honestly, Mother, the whole situation is becoming ridiculous. She's acting like we're trying to rob her instead of protect her. Evelyn froze, her hand still resting on a butternut squash, as the conversation continued just feet away behind a display of decorative gourds. Well, darling, came another voice, definitely Sloane's mother, with that particular blend of money and social position that Evelyn remembered from the wedding reception. These elderly widows can become quite irrational about their independence. It's actually a documented phenomenon. The isolation makes them paranoid. May appeared beside Evelyn, her face grim with understanding. Together, they moved slightly closer to the vendor's truck, using the morning shopping crowd as cover while straining to hear the conversation that was about to reveal everything. Gregory says we need to be more direct, Sloan continued. The soft approach isn't working. We need to make her understand that this isn't really a choice. It's a family responsibility. Andrew thinks if she just signs the basic power of attorney, we can restructure some of the assets to help with our cash flow situation. Andrew? Evelyn didn't recognize the name, but from context, it was clearly someone else involved in this family conspiracy. Her inheritance drama was apparently being discussed among people she'd never even met. How much do you need to get current on everything? Sloane's mother asked. $75,000 would cover the credit cards and the wedding planner. Another $50,000 would let us put a proper down payment on the Tessu property Andrew found. It's not like she'd even notice. Walter left her set for life. There was, laid out in the morning sunshine between displays of organic produce, the real motivation behind all those concerned conversations about her welfare. Sloan wasn't worried about Evelyn's capacity to handle her affairs. She was worried about her own capacity to handle her debts. The power of attorney abuse wasn't about protection. It was about access to what Sloan saw as family money that was being unreasonably hoarded by someone too old to appreciate its proper use. The thing is, Sloane's mother said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, if you can get her signed a healthcare proxy too, Andrew says there are ways to document concerns about her mental state. Once you have medical decision-making authority, You can request competency evaluations. And if those raise any questions, May's sharp intake of breath was audible even over the market noise. They were discussing not just financial manipulation, but medical manipulation, using healthcare proxy powers to manufacture evidence of incapacity that would support broader guardianship claims. Evelyn felt the world tilt slightly, the same sensation she'd experienced years ago when she discovered Walter's cancer diagnosis. Not exactly surprise. Some part of her had known things were worse than they appeared, but the particular nausea that comes with having your worst suspicions confirmed. "I need to sit down," she whispered to May. They found a bench near the plaza fountain, where the sound of water helped mask the trembling in Evelyn's voice as she processed what she'd just learned. Her inspiring widow story was turning into something much darker, a calculated campaign to strip her of autonomy, using the very love she felt for her son as the weapon against her. "They're not just after your money," May said bluntly. "They're after your mind. Once someone has both financial and medical power of attorney, they can manufacture any reality they want. Incompetent widow who needs protection, grateful elderly mother who happily signed over control, family hero who stepped in just in time to prevent disaster." Evelyn thought about all the women she'd known over the years who gradually disappeared into the background of their own lives, not through illness or genuine incapacity, but through the slow erosion of their right to make decisions, to disagree, to maintain boundaries. It was a particularly cruel form of disposal, wrapped in love and legalized through family court systems that often couldn't distinguish between genuine protection and sophisticated control. "What am I going to do?" Evelyn asked. "If I keep refusing, they'll escalate. But if I give in..." "If you give in, you disappear," May said firmly. "Not all at once, but piece by piece, decision by decision, until there's nothing left of Evelyn Hart except a signature on whatever documents they put in front of you." They sat by the fountain for another hour, watching families enjoy their Saturday morning routines, while Evelyn's own family plotted to dismantle her independence. Children chased pigeons while their parents browsed vendor stalls. Couples shared funnel cakes and debated which pottery to buy for their kitchens. All around them, life proceeded with its normal complications and small joys, while Evelyn grappled with the realization that her son had chosen his wife's ambitions over his mother's autonomy. When they finally headed home, May walked Evelyn to her front door and waited while she unlocked it. "You know what you have to do now," May said. Evelyn nodded, her hand already reaching for the red leather portfolio. "I have to tell Evan what I heard. And you have to decide if you're willing to lose him to save yourself." It was the hardest truth anyone had spoken to her since Walter's death. As May walked back to her own house, Evelyn stood in her doorway listening to the screen door click in the desert wind, that small sound that had become the rhythm of her resistance. Tomorrow would bring the conversation that would either restore her son to himself or confirm that she'd already lost him to someone else's dreams. Either way, she would not be signing those papers. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Sunday evening, just as Evelyn was settling into her evening routine of herbal tea and a mystery novel, headlights swept across her living room windows. Through the blinds, she could see both Evan's truck and Sloane's BMW in her driveway. They'd come together this time, a united front designed to overcome her resistance through coordinated pressure. Evelyn set down her tea and walked to the front door, Ruth's business cards in her pocket and Walter's words echoing in her mind. When they come as a group, they're no longer asking. They're demanding. She opened the door before they could knock, denying them even the small power that comes with being the one who seeks entry. "Good evening," she said, her voice pleasant but not welcoming. "This is unexpected." Sloane stepped forward, clearly designated as the spokesperson for this mission. She looked tired around the edges, her usual polish slightly tarnished by what Evelyn now recognized as the stress of mounting debt and failing plans. "Evelyn, we need to resolve the situation tonight. Gregory has been patient, but there are time-sensitive issues with your estate planning that can't wait any longer." They moved into the living room, where Sloane immediately began unpacking documents from her briefcase, while Evan stood awkwardly by the door, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The family dynamics were painfully clear. Sloane leading, Evan following, Evelyn positioned as the obstacle to be overcome. I've been doing some research, Sloan continued, spreading papers across the coffee table with practiced efficiency, about elderly financial abuse and how families can protect their loved ones. Did you know that widows lose an average of $83,000 per year to financial exploitation? That cognitive decline can happen gradually, so slowly that the person experiencing it doesn't recognize the changes. It was masterfully done. Statistics that sounded authoritative, medical concerns that played on universal fears about aging, all delivered with a concerned tone of someone who'd done her homework. Sloan had clearly spent considerable time crafting an argument that would make resistance seem irrational. I appreciate your research, Evelyn replied, settling into Walter's chair with deliberate calm. But I've done some research of my own. She reached into her pocket and placed one of Ruth's cards on the table between them. Ruth Delgado will be handling all my legal affairs going forward. She's been Walter's attorney for 15 years, and she understands our family's needs better than someone we just met. Sloane's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Evelyn, no disrespect to your attorney, but this requires specialized expertise. Gregory deals with these exact situations every day. He knows how to structure protections that regular estate attorneys might miss. Like what kind of protections? It was Evan who answered, his voice carrying the rehearsed quality of someone repeating arguments he'd heard multiple times. Like making sure you can't be taken advantage of by scam artists. Like having someone who can step in if you start making poor decisions about investments or... He stopped, clearly realizing how his words sounded. Or what, son? The silence that followed stretched long enough for everyone in the room to understand the implications. Sloan stepped into the gap with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to cleaning up other people's verbal mistakes. What Evan means is that having these protections in place gives everyone peace of mind. You know that if something happens, there's a clear plan. We know that you're safe. It's really about family security. Evelyn looked at her son, this man she'd raised to tell the truth even when it was difficult, and saw instead someone who'd learned to reshape truth into whatever shape would avoid conflict. It was a heartbreaking transformation, watching integrity erode under the pressure of keeping peace with a spouse who'd made war the price of love. Let me ask you both something, Evelyn said quietly. If I were 20 years younger but had the exact same inheritance, would we be having this conversation? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. Sloane's professional composure cracked slightly. That's not... Age isn't the issue here. The issue is making sure assets are properly protected and managed. By people who understand financial planning and legal structures. People like Gregory, who charges $500 an hour to tell elderly widows they can't be trusted with their own money. Sloane's mask slipped entirely. Evelyn, you're living in a fantasy if you think you can handle a $41 million estate by yourself. These assets need professional management, strategic planning, tax optimization. You spent 30 years balancing library budgets. This is completely different. And there was the core belief that had been driving this entire campaign. Not love, not protection, but the fundamental assumption that a woman who'd successfully managed her family's finances for 4 decades somehow became incompetent the moment her husband died and her bank balance grew large enough to attract attention. Evelyn stood up, walked to the kitchen, and returned with a manila folder. Inside were statements from the past 3 years, showing not just her account balances, but her investment decisions, charitable contributions, and tax strategies. Every number perfectly balanced, every decision carefully documented, every penny accounted for. I've been managing these assets for 3 years, she said, spreading the document on the table next to Sloane's power of attorney papers. Walter didn't leave me helpless. He left me prepared. Ruth helps with legal questions, but the financial decisions have been mine since the day he died. Evan leaned forward, studying his mother's financial records with the attention of someone seeing them for the first time. His face went through its own series of expressions as he realized that every concern Sloane had raised about his mother's capacity was contradicted by the evidence in front of him. Mom, these numbers. You've been handling everything perfectly. Yes, Evelyn said simply. I have. Sloane gathered her documents with sharp, efficient movements, her frustration finally showing through her practiced composure. This is exactly the kind of prideful thinking that gets elderly people into trouble. You can't see the forest for the trees. Maybe, Evelyn replied, reaching into her pocket for another of Ruth's cards. But I can see the vultures circling just fine. She placed the card directly in front of Sloane, close enough that there was no way to miss the message. Any future legal discussions will go through Ruth. And Sloane? In case you're wondering about my mental capacity, I was standing near the gourd display at the farmer's market last Saturday when you and your mother were discussing how my signature would solve your cash flow problems. The color drained from Sloane's face so quickly that Evelyn almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then she remembered a conversation about manufacturing medical concerns, about using healthcare proxy powers to document incompetency, and her sympathy evaporated like morning dew in desert heat. I think this conversation is over, Sloane said, standing abruptly. I think you're right, Evelyn agreed. After they left, Evelyn stood in her kitchen loading the dishwasher and thinking about boundaries, how they could be drawn with legal documents and business cards, but how they had to be maintained with daily choices, moment-by-moment decisions about what kind of treatment to accept and what kind of love was worth keeping. That night, alone in a house that had sheltered her marriage and now witnessed her widowhood, Evelyn found herself unable to sleep. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea and settled into Walter's chair with a red leather portfolio open in her lap, reading through his careful instructions by lamplight while the desert wind rattled the windows. My dearest Evelyn, his final letter began, if you're reading this again, it means someone is asking you to sign away pieces of yourself. Please remember that you are not a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved. You are a woman who deserves to live her own life on her own terms for as long as she draws breath. The tears came then, not the bitter tears of anger, but the cleansing tears of grief mixed with gratitude. Walter had known this day would come, had understood that wealth could make a widow target, that family love could be weaponized, that the very people who claimed to want to protect her might be the ones she most needed protection from. Outside her bedroom window, she could see the hummingbird feeder swaying gently in the wind. Even in the darkness, she knew that tiny bird would return at first light, fierce and independent and beholden to no one. Walter had seen that same quality in her, had built her protections around the belief that she would find the strength to use them when the time came. The phone rang at 10:30, startling her from her thoughts. Evan's name appeared on the caller ID, and something in her chest tightened with the certainty that this call would change everything between them. Mom. His voice was rough, strained. Can I come over? I need to talk to you. Alone. 20 minutes later, Evan sat across from her at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold while he struggled to find words. He looked older than his 34 years, worn down by weeks of being pulled between two women who both claimed to love him, but who wanted very different things from that love. I heard you today, he said finally, at the market, what Sloane said about the money, about the plans. He stopped, rubbing his face with both hands. I didn't know about the debt. I didn't know about any of it. Evelyn felt her heart break a little for the son who'd inherited his father's trusting nature, but not his ability to see past pretty facades. What did you think this was about, Evan? I thought. He struggled with the words, with admitting how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. Sloane made it sound like you were being stubborn about routine paperwork, like you were risking your own security because you didn't want to admit you might need help someday. She had articles about elderly financial abuse, stories about widows who lost everything because they were too proud to accept family assistance. And what do you think now? Evan was quiet for so long that Evelyn could hear the kitchen clock ticking, the refrigerator humming, the distant sound of a train whistle carrying across the desert. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I think I married someone who sees your inheritance as our solution to problems I didn't even know we had. He looked up at her with eyes that held a terrible new understanding. And I think I've been helping her pressure you because I was too scared to see what was really happening. The admission hung between them like a bridge that had finally been built after months of standing on opposite shores. Evelyn reached across the table and took her son's hands, feeling how cold they were despite the warm evening. Evan, What kind of marriage are you in where you have to choose between your wife's happiness and your mother's autonomy? It was the question she'd been afraid to ask, the one that cut to the heart of everything that had been happening since the engagement announcement. Evan's face crumpled as he confronted the reality he'd been avoiding, that he'd fallen in love with someone who saw his family as resources to be managed rather than people to be respected. "I don't know," he said. "I keep trying to find ways to make everyone happy, but Sloan says that's just avoiding adult responsibilities. She says that sometimes you have to make hard decisions for people you love, even if they don't understand why those decisions are necessary." "And what do you say?" "I say..." Evan stopped, looking around the kitchen where he'd grown up, where his father had taught him to scramble eggs and his mother had helped him with algebra homework. "I say I'm tired of feeling like I have to choose sides in my own family." Evelyn felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. This wasn't just about money or legal documents or even family dynamics. It was about the kind of man Evan would choose to become. Someone who protected the people who couldn't protect themselves, or someone who enabled the people who were strong enough to demand enablement. "Son," she said gently, "you don't have to choose sides, but you do have to choose values. And right now, you need to decide if you're the kind of man who helps pressure elderly women into signing over their independence, or the kind of man who stands up for what's right even when it's difficult." They talked until nearly midnight, working through years of family history, relationship patterns, and the gradual ways that manipulation could masquerade as love. Evan shared details about his marriage that painted a picture of someone who'd systematically isolated him from his own judgment, who'd trained him to see his mother's reasonable caution as unreasonable stubbornness. "She's been talking about having children," Evan said quietly, "about how we need to get our financial foundation solid before we start a family. And I keep thinking about what kind of father I'd be if I helped steal from my own mother to pay for my wife's dreams." When Evan finally left, Evelyn stood at her front door watching his taillights disappear into the Santa Fe night. The screen door clicked gently in the wind, that small sound that had become the soundtrack of her resistance. She didn't know if tonight's conversation had saved her son's marriage or ended it, but she knew it had restored something more important: his ability to see clearly, to choose consciously, to remember that love without boundaries eventually becomes indistinguishable from surrender. Inside, she carefully placed Walter's letter back in the red portfolio and locked it in the bedroom safe. Tomorrow would bring whatever consequences tonight's honesty had set in motion. But for the first time since the wedding, Evelyn Hart fell asleep feeling like herself again. The call came at 6 a.m, before the desert had fully awakened to another day of endless sky and wind-carved silence. Evelyn was already up, measuring coffee and watching the first hummingbird of the day test to feed her sweetness, when Evan's name appeared on her phone screen. "Mom, I'm coming over." "Just me. We need to talk." His voice carried something she hadn't heard in months. Clarity. Not the careful neutrality he developed to navigate between his wife and mother. Not the rehearsed concern that had flavored their recent conversations, but the straightforward honesty of someone who'd finally stopped trying to serve two masters. When he knocked on her door 20 minutes later, Evelyn could see the night's toll written across his face. His hair was uncombed, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes held the raw look of someone who'd spent hours staring at truths he'd been avoiding. But underneath the exhaustion, there was something else, a kind of relieved devastation that comes when you finally stop pretending things are fine when they're not. "I told Sloan I knew about the debt," he said without preamble, settling into the kitchen chair that had become his confession booth. "About the conversation at the farmer's market, about the real reason she wants you to sign those papers." Evelyn poured him coffee, noting that his hands trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the warm mug. How did she respond? First she denied it. Then she said I was twisting innocent conversations into something sinister. Then she said that even if she did need financial help, what was wrong with family helping family? Evan's laugh was hollow, self-aware. "She's very good at making you question your own perceptions." It was a classic pattern Evelyn recognized from her years working with the public. The way manipulative people could take your legitimate concerns and reflect them back as character flaws. Your caution became paranoia. Your boundaries became selfishness. Your resistance became evidence that you were exactly the kind of person who needed to have decisions made for them. What else did she say? Evan was quiet for a long moment. staring into his coffee as if the answers to his marriage might be floating somewhere between the surface and the bottom of the cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She said that if I really loved her, I'd convince you to think about family legacy differently. That hoarding wealth instead of using it to build family security was actually a form of selfishness. That wealthy widows who refuse to help their children are forcing those children to struggle unnecessarily while sitting on money they'll never spend. The sophistication of the argument was breathtaking. Sloan had managed to reframe Evelyn's financial independence as greed, her caution as cruelty, her refusal to surrender control as a failure of maternal love. It was manipulation refined to an art form designed to make both Evan and Evelyn question whether protecting her autonomy was really just disguised selfishness. And what did you tell her? I told her. Evan said, finally meeting his mother's eyes, that the woman who raised me taught me the difference between helping someone and enabling them, that you've been managing money responsibly since before Sloan was born, and that if she needed $75,000 to cover credit card debt, maybe the problem wasn't your unwillingness to provide it. Evelyn felt pride and heartbreak war in her chest. Pride that her son had finally found his backbone. Heartbreak that it had taken so long and cost so much for him to remember who he really was. How did that go over? She said I was choosing my mother over my wife, that I was proving I wasn't ready for marriage, that I was still a mama's boy who couldn't make adult decisions. Evan's voice grew stronger as he continued. And you know what, Mom? She was right about one thing. I was choosing you over her, because you never asked me to choose at all. There was the recognition that had been building since the wedding day, crystallizing into understanding. Real love, the kind Walter had shown Evelyn, and she tried to show Evan, didn't require surrender as proof of devotion. It didn't demand signatures on legal documents or compliance with other people's financial plans. It simply asked for respect, honesty, and the freedom to remain yourself within the relationship. I'm scared, Mom. Evan's admission came out rough and honest. I'm scared Sloan will leave. I'm scared I made a mistake marrying her. I'm scared that standing up for what's right means losing someone I thought I loved. Evelyn moved her chair closer to her son's, close enough to see the little boy who used to come to her when thunderstorms made the world feel dangerous and uncertain. Evan, listen to me carefully. Peace that requires someone else's surrender isn't peace at all. It's just postponed war. She took his hands in hers, feeling how cold they were despite the morning warmth. I forgive you for being weak. I understand the pressure you've been under, the impossible position you've been put in. But son, I cannot and will not unlock my life for that weakness. Love has to have boundaries, or it stops being love and becomes something else entirely. They sat together in the morning light, mother and son, while outside the hummingbird returned to its feeder and the desert wind continued its ancient conversation with the screen door. There were no dramatic declarations, no tears or raised voices, just a quiet recognition that some battles are worth fighting and some boundaries are worth defending, even when the cost is higher than you want to pay. What are you going to do? Evelyn asked. I'm going to go home and have a very honest conversation with my wife about what kind of marriage we actually have. Evan said, and then I'm going to decide if it's the kind of marriage I want to keep. When he left, Evelyn did watch his truck disappear down the street. Instead, she turned her attention to the business of her day, watering plants, checking the mail, maintaining the steady rhythm of a life lived on her own terms. The legal documents Sloan had left behind still sat on the coffee table, but they no longer seemed threatening. They were just paper now, powerless without her signature, meaningless without her consent. As she prepared lunch, Evelyn found herself humming an old song Walter used to sing while he worked in the garden. She couldn't remember all the words, but the melody was enough. Something about holding on, about staying strong, about love that lasted because it was freely given rather than legally required. Outside, the screen door clicked its familiar rhythm, and Evelyn smiled. Some sounds, she'd learned, were worth listening to. The final confrontation came not as a dramatic showdown, but as a quiet Tuesday morning phone call. Evelyn was tending her roses when her phone buzzed with text from Evan, coming by in an hour. Need to update you on some decisions. When he arrived, she could see immediately that something fundamental had shifted. He moved differently, straighter, more purposeful, like someone who'd remembered how to inhabit his own skin. His eyes were clear in a way they hadn't been since the engagement. And when he hugged her, it felt like her son rather than a diplomat from someone else's agenda. "I filed for separation yesterday," he said without preamble. "Sloan moved out Monday. The marriage is over." Evelyn felt the complex mixture of emotions that comes when someone you love makes a difficult but necessary choice. Relief that the pressure campaign against her autonomy would end. Sadness that her son's dreams of partnership had been built on such shaky foundations. And pride that he'd found the strength to choose his integrity over his comfort. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm devastated," Evan admitted, "and I'm relieved. And I'm ashamed that it took me so long to see what was happening." Sloan fought the separation hard. Said I was making a mistake, that I was choosing money over love, that you'd manipulated me into destroying my marriage. They settled onto the patio, where the morning light was beginning to warm the adobe walls and bring the garden to life. Evelyn watched her son's face as he worked through the emotional aftermath of dismantling a life he'd thought he wanted. "The thing is," Evan continued, "when she said I was choosing money over love, I realized she was right, but not the way she meant. I was choosing the love that came with conditions over the love that just existed. Your love never required me to prove it by signing papers or taking sides or sacrificing someone else's well-being." It was a recognition Evelyn had been hoping for but hadn't dared to expect. That authenticity, even when painful, created more security than manipulation, even when comfortable. Evan had learned the difference between peace and surrender, between love and control, between family loyalty and family exploitation. "What about Gregory and the legal pressure?" Evelyn asked. Turns out Gregory was more Sloan's attorney than mine. When she couldn't pay his retainer, he lost interest in the whole protection planning project pretty quickly. Evan's smile was rueful. Funny how dedicated he was to my family's welfare until the checks stopped coming. Over the following weeks, as autumn settled into its rhythm across northern New Mexico, Evelyn watched her son rebuild himself from the inside out. He started coming by regularly, not out of obligation or guilt, but because he genuinely enjoyed her company. They worked together in the garden, cooked family recipes that connected them to Walter's memory, and talked about everything except his failed marriage and her successful resistance. The inheritance drama, which had threatened to tear their small family apart, had instead revealed what was truly worth protecting. Not money, though money mattered. Not legal documents, though proper paperwork was essential. What mattered was a right to remain yourself within your relationships, the freedom to love people without surrendering your autonomy to prove that love. May, who'd watched the entire saga unfold from her kitchen window, made her own observations with characteristic bluntness. "That boy got lucky," she told Evelyn over coffee one morning. Better to learn what Sloan really was before they had children and a mortgage together. Evelyn agreed, though she kept her deeper thoughts to herself. She'd learned that some lessons could only be absorbed through experience, that some mistakes had to be made before wisdom could take root. Evan's brief marriage had taught him more about manipulation and authenticity than years of parental advice could have accomplished. The final piece of the puzzle came when Ruth Delgado called with news that made everything else fall into perspective. "Gregory Hale's been sanctioned by the state bar," Ruth reported. "Turns out he's been running a scheme targeting elderly widows across 3 counties. Aggressive power of attorney acquisition, asset redirection, family conflict manipulation, the whole operation." Evelyn wasn't surprised. Men like Gregory operated by finding people like Sloan, ambitious, desperate, willing to believe that other people's resources were family assets temporarily held by the wrong person. Together, they created a perfect storm of legal exploitation disguised as family protection. "What happens to women who did sign his documents?" Evelyn asked. "That's being sorted out through courts. But most of them will get their autonomy back. Eventually, the ones who are still alive to fight for it." The sobering reality was that Evelyn's story could have ended very differently. Without Walter's foresight, without Ruth's expertise, without May's friendship and her own stubborn refusal to be rushed into decisions, she could have become another cautionary tale about elderly financial abuse rather than an inspiring widow's story about resistance and recovery. On a crisp October morning, Exactly 2 months after Gregory's first unwelcome visit, Evelyn stood at her post office box, retrieving certified mail receipts. Each green return slip represented another piece of Walter's protection plan fully implemented. Credit monitoring services, bank security updates, legal document registrations. She pinned them to the bulletin board in her kitchen. Small proof that preparation and patience could triumph over pressure and manipulation. Later that day, as she was deadheading the last roses of the season, Evan appeared with a toolbox and an apologetic smile. "Thought you might want help with winterizing the garden," he said. "And I wanted to tell you something." They worked together in comfortable silence, cutting back perennials and mulching rose beds until the shadows grew long and the desert air carried the first hint of winter's approach. Finally, as they were putting away tools, Evan cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what Dad would say about all this, about the marriage, the legal stuff, the way I handled everything. And I think he'd say that loving someone means protecting their right to make their own choices, even when you disagree with those choices. And that the best way to honor the people who raise you is to become someone they'd be proud to know, not just someone who does what they tell you to do." Evelyn felt Walter's presence in those words, the echo of conversations they'd had about raising a son who could think for himself and love others without losing himself in the process. It had taken 34 years and a failed marriage, but Evan had finally learned the lesson his father had been trying to teach. As the sun set over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that existed nowhere else on earth, Evelyn Hart stood on her patio, listening to the familiar click of the screen door in the evening wind. The hummingbird feeder swayed gently, empty now but ready for tomorrow's visitors. In the distance, a train whistle carried across the desert, lonesome and eternal. Her phone buzzed with a text from Evan. "Thanks for not giving up on me. I'll call you tomorrow, and I'll knock first." Some boundaries, Evelyn thought, were worth everything it cost to maintain them. 6 months later, Evelyn Hart stood in the same kitchen where Gregory Hale had tried to convince her to sign away her independence, but everything felt different now. The morning light streaming through her windows carried the warmth of late spring, and the hummingbird feeder outside buzzed with activity as the tiny warriors returned from their winter migration. The red leather portfolio sat open on the table beside her coffee cup, but she was reading different documents now. Correspondence from Ruth about establishing a charitable foundation, investment statements showing steady growth under her careful management, and a letter from Evan expressing interest in eventually joining the foundation's board. Not as her power of attorney, but as her partner in giving back to the community that had shaped their family. The transformation in her son had been gradual but profound. The scared, conflicted man who'd stood between two women's competing demands had evolved into someone who understood that authentic relationships didn't require anyone to disappear for someone else's comfort. He'd started therapy, begun rebuilding his sense of self, and slowly reconnected with the values Walter had tried to instill in him. "I keep thinking about something Dad used to say," Evan had told her recently, "that signatures map a life, and no one gets a hold of legend but you. I spent months trying to convince you to hand over your map because I was afraid to draw boundaries on mine." The divorce had been finalized quietly, without drama or extended legal battles. Sloan had moved back to Colorado, where family money could support her lifestyle, while she regrouped and perhaps found another family to see as a solution to her financial problems. Gregory Hale was facing disbarment proceedings and criminal charges for his targeting of elderly clients across multiple counties. But for Evelyn, the real victory wasn't in what had been prevented, but in what had been preserved, her dignity, her autonomy, and her relationship with her son, which had grown stronger through honesty rather than weaker through conflict. The inspiring widow's story wasn't about defeating villains, but about remembering that love without boundaries eventually becomes indistinguishable from surrender. May knocked on the patio door, carrying her morning coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose predictions had proven accurate. "How's our boy doing?" she asked, settling into her favorite chair. "He's learning," Evelyn replied. "Slowly, but he's learning. And you? How are you handling your victory?" Evelyn considered the question seriously. Victory felt too simple a word for what had actually happened. She protected her assets, yes, but more importantly, she protected her right to make choices about her own life. She'd refused to become disposable in her own family story, had insisted on remaining the author of her own decisions rather than accepting the supporting role of grateful elderly mother who knew her place. "I'm learning, too," she said finally, "learning that kindness needs a spine, that you can be gentle and still choose steel when steel is required." The months that followed brought their own lessons. Evelyn discovered that standing firm in family relationships often meant short-term discomfort, but long-term respect. Evan's friends, many of whom had watched their own elderly parents navigate similar pressures, began asking for Ruth Delgado's contact information. Word spread quietly through their social circle about the widow who'd refused to sign, who'd proven that age didn't automatically mean vulnerability. Dr. Naomi Fields, Evelyn's longtime physician, made her own observations during a routine checkup. "You seem different," she noted. "More settled, but also more energetic. Like you've been carrying something heavy and finally set it down." It was an accurate assessment. Evelyn had been carrying the weight of other people's expectations about what elderly widowhood should look like. Quiet, compliant, grateful for any attention, willing to trade autonomy for the appearance of family care. Setting down that weight had freed energy she'd forgotten she possessed. She'd started volunteering at a legal aid clinic, helping other elderly residents understand their rights and recognize the difference between genuine family concern and sophisticated manipulation. The work drew on everything she'd learned from her own experience, from Walter's preparation, from Ruth's expertise, and from May's unflinching support. "The thing about vultures," she told a support group for elderly financial abuse survivors, "is they're just doing what vultures do. The problem comes when we mistake them for eagles and invite them to nest in our lives." As spring turned towards summer, Evelyn began receiving calls from adult children of elderly parents, people who'd heard about her story and wanted advice on how to approach legitimate protection planning without triggering defensive responses. She discovered that her experience had taught her to recognize the difference between authentic care and sophisticated control, knowledge that proved valuable to families trying to navigate the complex intersection of aging, independence, and genuine protection needs. "The key," she would tell them, "is remembering that protection plans should protect the person, not the people who want access to the person. If your elderly parent is competent today, treat them like they're competent today. Plan for possible future incapacity, yes, but don't manufacture present incapacity to justify taking control now." On a warm June evening, as Evelyn and May sat on the patio watching the sunset paint the mountains in impossible shades of purple and gold, May raised her coffee cup in a mock toast. "To women who refuse to be managed," she said. "To love that doesn't require surrender," Evelyn replied. "To the difference between protection and control. To boundaries that make love possible instead of boundaries that make love conditional." They clicked their coffee cups together. Two elderly widows who'd learned that growing older didn't mean growing smaller, that wealth didn't automatically make you vulnerable, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for your family was refuse to enable their worst impulses. As darkness settled over Santa Fe and the first stars appeared over the desert, Evelyn Hart sat in the life she'd chosen to keep. Complicated sometimes, lonely occasionally, but authentically hers. The screen door clicked gently in the evening breeze, that small sound that had become the rhythm of her resistance and now served as a soundtrack to her peace. In her purse, she still carried one of Ruth's business cards, though she rarely needed to use them anymore. The message had been received and understood. Evelyn Hart was not disposable, not manageable, not available for anyone else's convenience. She was simply powerfully herself. The hummingbird feeder swayed in the desert wind, waiting for tomorrow's visitors. Tiny, fierce creatures who knew that some things were worth fighting for, that some territories were worth defending, and that the smallest among us could teach the largest lessons about courage, persistence, and the absolute necessity of remaining free. Sometimes, Evelyn thought as she locked the front door and turned off the patio lights, the most radical thing an elderly woman could do was simply refuse to disappear. In a world that preferred its widows grateful and compliant, choosing to remain visible, vocal, and valuable was its own form of revolution. And revolution, it turned out, could be as quiet as morning coffee, as simple as refusing to sign your name, and as powerful as remembering that you'd never stopped being worth protecting especially from the people who claimed protection was what they were offering. Kindness, Evelyn had learned, needed a spine, and some signatures were too dangerous to give, no matter how much love was offered in exchange for them. If this story resonates with you, if you've seen elderly family members face similar pressures, or if you're concerned about protecting your own autonomy as you age, remember, you are not disposable. You have the right to professional legal advice, to take time with major decisions, and to love your family without surrendering your independence to prove that love. Sometimes the most generous thing we can do is teach the people who love us that real love doesn't require anyone to disappear.